You've been told men are the ones who want it more. That desire is your burden, your weakness, your problem to manage. You've been told women are different, that they're passive, responsive, selective, that they need to be convinced, warmed up, eased into wanting anything at all. And you believed it, because it explained why you were always the one pushing forward while she seemed to hold back. It gave you a story that made sense of the imbalance. But what if that story was never true? What if it was taught to you because the alternative would be too destabilizing to say out loud? Here's the contradiction most men aren't ready for. Women don't want less. They want more. More intensity, more immersion, more of the internal fire that society trained them to suffocate before it ever reached the surface. From the outside, restraint looks like disinterest. Control looks like indifference. Silence looks like absence. But underneath that surface is pressure, constant, managed pressure, because wanting openly has consequences. They were taught to fear early, so they had learned to hide it, to redirect it, to pretend it isn't there. This is why so many men feel like they're chasing something that never quite reveals itself. You're reading behavior that was designed to conceal, not express. You're interpreting discipline as lack. And the deeper tension is this: if women actually crave more than they show, then everything you were taught about desire is inverted. The rules change. The signals flip. And the question becomes uncomfortable. What if the truth is the opposite, and society depends on you to never realizing it? The lie men were raised on is woven so deeply into culture that it feels biological. You were taught that men are driven by desire, and women are driven by connection. That you want release, and she wants meaning. That you chase, and she chooses. The story was clean, convenient, and wrong. It didn't describe reality, it organized behavior in a way that kept female desire controlled and male desire visible. And once you see that, a lot of confusion suddenly makes sense. Male desire is allowed to be obvious because it's framed as physical, direct, discharging tension. It moves outward, seeks expression, and resolves itself through release. That's why it's rarely treated as dangerous once expressed. It's gone. Female desire works in the opposite direction. It doesn't rush toward release. It pulls inward. It deepens. It immerses. It builds layers of sensation, imagination, and psychological involvement that don't dissipate quickly. That kind of desire isn't brief or disposable. It's persistent. And persistence is precisely what made it threatening to regulate socially. So instead of erasing female desire, culture learned to suppress it, to rename it, to reframe it as something softer, safer, more relational. Women weren't told they didn't want. They were taught to manage wanting, to downplay it, to delay it, to package it as connection rather than appetite. Because a woman too openly immersed in her desire disrupts order. She stops being predictable. She stops being easily judged. And that loss of control has always made systems uncomfortable. This is why female desire feels invisible to men. You're looking for outward signs that mirror your own experience, but hers was never designed to show itself that way. It lives in internal immersion, not external pursuit. It intensifies through imagination, anticipation, and emotional saturation rather than action alone. And because it doesn't burn off quickly, it has to be contained. That containment is misread as lack. Here's the line that reframes everything if you let it land. Men were allowed to want. Women were taught to manage wanting. One expression was normalized. The other was disciplined. And once you understand that difference, you stop mistaking restraint for absence. You realize that what looks like lower desire is often higher pressure. What looks like indifference is often control. The lie wasn't about who wants more. It was about who was permitted to show it and who was trained to hide it well enough that even you would believe it wasn't there at all. Female desire didn't disappear. It was trained to go underground, and that training started early, long before she ever understood what she was suppressing. The first pressure was reputation. From the beginning, desire carried a cost for her that it never carried for you. Wanting openly was punished, socially judged, labeled, remembered. Restraint, on the other hand, was rewarded. The woman who appeared controlled was praised. The woman who revealed appetite was reduced to it. Over time, the lesson became clear. Expression costs status. Silence preserves it. So she learned to compress wanting inward, to let it exist without being. The second pressure was safety. Wanting openly made her vulnerable in ways men rarely experience. Desire signaled availability, and availability invited risk misinterpretation, boundary violations, loss of control over how she was treated. So control became protection. Managing desire wasn't just about reputation, it was about survival. She learned to regulate herself before the world could do it for her, to stay one step ahead of the consequences by appearing neutral, selective, even uninterested. That discipline didn't erase desire, it sharpened it, while teaching her never to let it leak unfiltered. The third pressure was identity conflict, and this one cut deepest. She was taught to be respectable, composed, measured. But desire is none of those things. Desire is messy, immersive, destabilizing. So she was forced into an internal split. Wanting existed, but it couldn't be integrated into who she was allowed to be. Instead of expressing desire, she internalized it. Instead of acting on it, she narrated it privately. Instead of embodying it, she managed it. Over time, the mask became automatic. She didn't wake up deciding to hide it, became her default state. This is where men misread everything. You see the restraint and assume absence. You see the control and assume indifference. But what you're actually seeing is compression, pressure held under discipline. The more intense the wanting, the more necessary the control. The woman who appears calm is often carrying far more than she allows herself to show. This is the insight that reframes the entire conversation. If you're willing to accept it, she didn't lose desire. She learned to bury it. Not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to cause consequences if left unmanaged. And once desire is buried deeply enough, it stops looking like desire at all. It starts looking like restraint, like distance, like silence, until the right conditions loosen the lid and everything you thought was missing suddenly floods to the surface. Female desire doesn't behave the way you were taught to look for it. It doesn't announce itself early, and it doesn't rush toward expression. It builds slowly, quietly, often invisibly. And because it builds rather than spikes, it burns longer once ignited. This is the part men miss, because you're trained to recognize movement, escalation, outward pursuit. Her desire doesn't move that way. It accumulates, layer by layer, thought by thought, feeling by feeling. And the danger is that accumulation looks like nothing until it suddenly. What fuels female desire isn't action first. It's imagination, anticipation, internal narrative. She doesn't need constant stimulation to want more. She needs space for the story to grow. Silence gives that story room. Gaps give it oxygen. The moments where nothing happens externally are often where everything intensifies internally. While you're waiting for a signal, she's replaying, reinterpreting, extending the feeling inside herself. This is why men so often kill desire by doing too much. Action interrupts accumulation. Noise collapses imagination. Because her desire is carried internally, it doesn't resolve itself quickly. It lingers. It follows her. It weaves into her sense of self. This is why female desire feels heavier, deeper, harder to discharge. It doesn't disappear just because it isn't acted on. It stays present, managed, contained. That containment is misread as indifference, when it's actually persistence under control. The longer it's held, the stronger it becomes, provided it isn't forced into premature expression. Male desire seeks release. Once expressed, it settles. Female desire seeks immersion. Once ignited, it wants to stay alive, not end. This difference explains countless misunderstandings. You think desire should show itself early and clearly. She experiences desire as something that grows safest when it isn't exposed too soon. The more it's protected from judgment and pressure, the more power it gathers. This is why environments that feel calm, ambiguous, and unforced often intensify her wanting far more than obvious pursuit ever could. Here's the line that reframes everything if you let it land. What men release, women carry. You move tension outward to resolve it. She holds tension inward to deepen it. One system empties itself, the other fills itself. And once you understand that, you stop mistaking silence for absence. You stop assuming slowness means less. You realize that what looks restrained on the surface is often building pressure underneath. Female desire doesn't need to be activated loudly. It needs to be given time, space, and enough quiet to grow into something that lasts far longer than a spike ever could. Women often seem colder than they are because what you're seeing is not absence of desire, but containment of it. There is a contradiction at the center of female behavior that confuses men: endlessly high internal intensity paired with low external expression. From the outside, it looks like indifference, distance, emotional restraint. But internally, there can be a constant managed current running beneath the surface. The mistake men make is assuming expression equals intensity. In reality, for women, expression is often the opposite of control. The psychological reason is simple and brutal. Expression carries risk. Desire, once shown, can be judged, misused, or used against her. It can change how she's seen, how she's treated, how much leverage she feels she has left. So she learns early that suppression preserves control, not because she lacks feeling, but because she understands the cost of revealing it. Control allows her to decide when, how, and if desire is ever allowed to surface. That discipline is misread as coldness, when it's actually self-regulation under pressure. This is why many women appear calm precisely when they're feeling the most. The stronger the internal pull, the tighter the external restraint, She's not disconnected, she's bracing, holding the line between wanting and being seen wanting. Because once desire is visible, it no longer belongs entirely to her. It becomes a shared object, subject to reaction, expectation, and interpretation. Keeping it internal allows her to own it without consequence. Men often take this personally. You assume her restraint is about you, your attractiveness, your timing, your effort. But more often, it's about her relationship with exposure. Desire doesn't scare her. Losing control over it does. So she stays measured. She stays composed. She appears selective, not because she wants less, but because she wants to remain sovereign over what she feels. This is where the confusion deepens. You lean in, expecting warmth to rise in response. Instead, she cools, not to reject you, but to rebalance herself. Because the closer something gets to the surface, the more pressure she feels to manage it. The colder she appears, the more force she may be containing underneath. This is the line that clarifies everything. If you're willing to accept it, the woman who seems restrained is often the one fighting the strongest current. What you interpret as lack is frequently resistance, not resistance to you, but resistance to exposure. Once you understand that, you stop trying to force expression and start respecting containment. And paradoxically, that respect is often what lowers the pressure enough for desire to finally reveal itself on its own terms. Men misread the signals because they're looking for the wrong language. You were taught to read desire through movement initiation, escalation, visible enthusiasm. So when she goes quiet, you assume interest dropped. When she stays controlled, you assume she doesn't care. When she moves slowly, you assume she's unsure or uninterested. None of these interpretations come from malice or stupidity. They come from applying a male framework to a female system that operates under different constraints. Silence, to you, feels like absence. To her, it's often management. Silence is where she keeps pressure contained so it doesn't spill out prematurely. When she doesn't verbalize wanting, it doesn't mean wanting isn't there. It means it's being held internally, filtered, regulated. Expression is not the default state for female desire. Containment is us. So when you interpret silence as lack, you're mistaking discipline for emptiness. Control gets misread the same way. You see composure and think indifference, but control is frequently a response to intensity, not a lack of it. The more she feels internally, the more carefully she may move on the outside. Control is how she stays sovereign over something that could expose her if mishandled. To you, restraint looks like distance. To her nervous system, restraint is how she stays safe while carrying a strong internal current. Slowness is another signal men consistently misinterpret. You assume desire should accelerate outward the way yours does, but female desire often slows the body while accelerating the mind. Slowness gives her time to integrate what she feels without being forced into expression. When you rush that process, you collapse it. When you mistake slowness for low interest, you miss the accumulation happening underneath. The core principle tying all of this together is simple but uncomfortable. Female desire is often invisible until conditions are safe. Safe doesn't mean boring or passive. It means unpressured, unjudged, unforced into proof. Until those conditions exist, desire stays internal by necessity, not because she's withholding, but because exposure has consequences she's learned to respect. This is where male blindness shows up most clearly. You're scanning for signs of movement while she's managing pressure. You're looking for evidence while she's controlling risk. And the more you push for visible confirmation, the more you increase the very pressure she's trying to regulate. Understanding this doesn't mean becoming passive or hesitant. It means recalibrating what you interpret as signal versus noise. Once you stop demanding expression as proof, you start noticing different cues. Not urgency, but depth. Not speed, but consistency of presence. And in that shift, you stop misreading restraint as rejection. You recognize it as what it often is, desire that hasn't been given permission to surface yet. If you want to stop killing desire, the first move is internal, not behavioral. You stop chasing reaction. Reaction is the most misleading metric men use because it rewards visibility over depth. When you chase reaction, you teach her nervous system that expression is expected. Expected expression becomes performance. Performance collapses desire. The moment she feels she's being measured by how much she shows, she starts managing herself instead of feeling herself. And once management enters, desire steps back. The same is true when you demand proof. Proof sounds reasonable interest should show itself. Right that proof introduces judgment. It turns desire into something she has to demonstrate instead of experience. The paradox is brutal. The more you need confirmation, the less safe it becomes for her to offer it. Desire cannot breathe under evaluation. It contracts. So when you stop demanding proof, you're not lowering standards. You're removing pressure that never should have been there. Rushing expression is the final mistake that quietly kills everything. Expression is the last stage of desire, not the first. When you push for it early, you force desire to surface before it's ready. And what surfaces prematurely rarely survives. Female desire needs time to accumulate internally before it wants to be seen. When you rush that process, you don't speed it up, you abort it. What could have deepened instead dissolves. The reframe is simple but exacting. You create emotional safety without expectation. Safety doesn't mean reassurance or over-accommodation. It means your presence doesn't demand anything from her internal world. She's not responsible for maintaining your confidence. She's not managing your impatience. She's allowed to feel without being watched. That absence of pressure is what allows desire to move naturally instead of defensively. At the same time, you maintain polarity without pressure. Polarity doesn't come from pursuit. It comes from groundedness. You don't flatten yourself to be acceptable, and you don't lean in to extract a response. You stay centered, interested, but not urgent, present, but not needy. That balance creates contrast, something desire requires to stay alive. Most importantly, you let desire surface on her terms, not because you're passive, but because desire that arrives voluntarily is stronger than desire pulled out by force. This is where the line lands with uncomfortable clarity. The less you demand desire, the more room it has to breathe. When you remove pressure, desire stops hiding. When you stop chasing it, it starts revealing itself, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that lasts far longer than anything you could have forced. The final truth most men never hear is the one that reframes every interaction you've ever had with women. Women don't lack desire, they lack permission. Permission to feel it openly. permission to express it without consequence, permission to let it move through them without immediately having to contain, explain, or justify it. Once you understand this, the entire narrative flips. What you thought was absence reveals itself as restriction. What you mistook for indifference reveals itself as discipline. Female desire was never weaker than yours. If anything, it was too powerful to be left unmanaged. That's why it was shaped, softened, redirected, and confined long before adulthood. A woman expressing desire freely disrupts expectations. She becomes harder to categorize, harder to control, harder to shame into compliance. So the system didn't remove desire. It narrowed the channels through which it could flow. Over time, those narrowed channels became internal. Desire learned to live quietly, intensely, and privately. This is why so many men feel like they're circling something they can't quite reach. You're not failing to awaken desire. You're colliding with the boundaries built around it. Boundaries that don't exist because she doesn't want, but because wanting has consequences she's learned to avoid. When you push against those boundaries, desire doesn't rise to meet you. It retreats further inside, not out of rejection, but out of self-preservation. Understanding this shifts how you see yourself as a man. You stop trying to pull desire out of her. You stop interpreting restraint as a verdict on your worth. You realize that the absence of expression often means the presence of pressure. And pressure doesn't dissolve through force. It dissolves through permission, through environments where nothing is demanded, nothing is rushed, and nothing is used against her later. This is why some men seem to access a depth of desire others never see. Not because they're more attractive or more skilled, but because they don't require desire to prove itself. They don't force it into the open. They create space where it doesn't need armor. In that space, desire doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't need to be managed. It can finally move outward instead of turning in on itself. Let this land without turning it into a tactic. Female desire wasn't weaker, it was restricted. And once you stop mistaking restriction for lack, you stop fighting what you never understood. You begin to recognize that the real work was never about creating desire, but about not becoming another reason it had to stay hidden. There's a quiet shift that happens once this finally settles in. Not excitement, not confidence, something deeper. You stop seeing women as puzzles to solve or gates to force open. You stop interpreting restraint as rejection and silence as lack. Instead, you recognize how much weight has been placed on her wanting and how carefully she's been taught to carry it. That recognition changes how you move. You become less reactive, less impatient, less hungry for signs that were never meant to be obvious. You no longer feel the urge to prove yourself through pressure or persistence. You stop confusing pursuit with strength. What replaces it is a kind of stillness that doesn't ask anything from her inner world. And that stillness is felt. It creates contrast in a culture built on demand. Where most men add noise, you remove it. Where most men rush expression, you protect space. Not to manipulate, but because you finally understand what desire needs in order to exist without armor. This is where power quietly returns to you, not over her, but over yourself. You're no longer measuring moments by how much she shows. You're present without fishing, interested without extracting, grounded without closing off. That balance doesn't spark fireworks on command. It does something rarer. It lowers defenses that have been trained for years. And when those defenses soften, desire doesn't feel risky anymore. It feels natural. Nothing about this is loud. There's no performance, no conquest, no dramatic payoff, just a subtle reordering of how you relate to wanting itself. You stop trying to pull it into the open. You stop mistaking control for absence. You realize that most of what you thought was missing was simply hidden behind pressure that didn't need to be there. And when you understand this, you stop trying to awaken desire in her and start removing the world that taught her to hide it.